So as I said before, my name is Marie-Louise Miller. I am an event producer for RiverArts, and I want to take 1 second to thank our sponsors. We are proudly supported by ARTSWESTCHESTER and the New York State Council for the Arts. And without their generous operational support and overall support, we wouldn't be able to do events like this today. So thank you to them. I hope that you got a chance to walk around a little bit and just take a look at the studio. It's always transforming. Every time I come here, there's something new. And every time I come here, there's the rock. And since it happens to be in the middle of our space, well, I don't want to ignore the elephant in the room. I just want to acknowledge this rock. It's absolutely amazing. It's the best rock in the world. And before we launch into like the details of an interview, Malcolm, can you tell us just a tiny bit about the rock?
Yeah, so the rock used to be on the sort of edge of the Hudson. Don't tell anyone, but there was someone here with like a big machine one day, and I convinced them that they could bring the rock out, and then I got it in here, and it's been there for ever since. But it's kind of like the sculpture that I make in some ways, I guess like I find it to be like a bit of a sort of springboard of taking like some of the language and things that happens in that rock and making other kind of forms that relate to that. And so it's sort of something I'm interested in using one day, but for now it's a good, if we have any, we thought we were short seats, so just in case.
Right. So it's kind of like a muse.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now I'm going to read a quote about you.
Okay.
I hope it doesn't embarrass you. But it's kind of cool, and then I just want you to respond to it. So it says, led by the desire to capture the potential for movement in the objects around us, and influenced by the world as seen through the lens of a microscope, Malcolm creates sculpture which leads the imagination to touch the sublime. What do you think about that?
I said that?
That's been said about
well,
you, about
okay.
your work and the effect it has on us. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of potential for movement and objects around us, and the world seen through a microscope?
Sure. Yeah, I guess microscope, that language is very specific, but in like a broad way, like like these sort of panels that are behind us, there were a couple years ago, like this space and its relationship to the river and like the stuff that washes up is some of the stuff that I'm kind of interested in. I don't know exactly the reason for all of it, but one thing that is really lovely in the winter, ice sort of stacks up on the river and makes these very beautiful forms, and I was interested in like tessellated patterns and like stained glass and like quilting and those old Tiffany lights that have these sort of beautiful frames. So I was making these forms that start out as grids and then get filled in, and kind of felt they in a certain way resembled the ice, and then also it's like on the micro and macro level looking at like the surfaces of a stone, or even like the cracks that run through this building are kind of, I think, useful and really beautiful. In a way, sculpture is sort of about wanting to sort of like hear a new sound in a way, like with form, like to be able to see something that you were kind of curious about and then see it in real space and see what that does. So, and then along the way, a lot of at least the way that I work on most of these, they kind of start out as an idea, and then that falls by the wayside, and then it happens again and again, and then eventually something that's sort of something very different than what it was originally intended ends up sort of emerging. So like these two on the wall is called matching windows, matching doors, about this sort of duality of the pattern, but they both started out connected to this other one that's on the floor over there, and that still hasn't been worked out. But I guess I get into those ones because they kind of have that micro surface.
Mm-hmm.
That answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was perfect. So I want to take now just a giant leap backwards, and I want to know. Well, quick bio. Where did you grow up? And in your childhood of growing up, do you have a memory of objects, of fascination, of building, of creating? Like, was there a place in your life that this grew out of, or was it sort of a slow undulation into where you are now?
Well, I grew up in Westchester in Ardsley, and my mom was in the audience, and my parents, they took us we went hiking a lot, and we were always outdoors. And I remember as a kid, we wouldn't, unless it was dark, we couldn't come back in, I think, or something like that. But I remember as a kid with my dad making things like on a beach, and just like years later, just still remembering like the image of these kind of dreamlike structures with, driftwood and things of that nature. So I think that's sort of always been like the fabric. I've always liked making things. But probably growing up outside and building forts in the woods as a kid was sort of an entryway. Yeah.
It's wonderful. And when you look at the materials around you, what drew you to working in these materials specifically? Like, what is it about these that draws you? Because it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting question. So I think like one of the things that metal does, like nothing else, is has the ability to do this, which is that seems so simple, but it's wonderful because it's got this sort of permanence, impermanence thing. So you do something and it feels like it's like that forever, and then you can go back in and change it, and it stays. If you're working maybe with like a block of clay, the mark making is cumulative, and it's a pushing and pulling all the time. But with metals, the imprint of what you do is sort of permanent until you decide to go back and change it. Which in a practical way is great, because like a lot of these things have been on the floor for like a couple of years in here, and if they were made of something else, they'd probably, when you return to them, maybe it'd be positive sometimes, but they would change a lot. But also like the ability for like steel and things to hold itself up, it's really freeing in a way, because like these objects that are behind the group they're puddles of aluminum that were poured on a bed of sand on the floor, and then you can lift them up, and like they could be this thick, and that it's a thing. So I think it's maybe just a really basic gravity of this ability that the material holds its imprint. A few years ago, I started making more cast objects because I started having the ability to do that. These sculptures that are here are made by welding small bits and pieces of I guess factory-made materials together, so that it's almost like working with paper. Like the sheet material is flat, and then there's various sizes of tubes and solid bar sections, and it's a very, you don't use a lot of material working with lots of small things, so it's a very you get a lot of economy out of working that way. Whereas like casting stuff, it requires a bunch of sort of support materials, I guess. But in terms of like my other, outside of being a sculptor, I do other like architectural projects and castings for other people in metal, and so almost as if I was like a writer, that I have this other job that's writing maybe grants for someone else or editing. So it's still about organizing that same material, which is kind of lovely, because sometimes it's boring, but sometimes it's like an opportunity to find something new out about this thing that I thought I knew on someone else's whim. So there's always a couple guest objects that are here. So like these totems in the front they're made of pine wood, and they're going to be cast in bronze for an artist named Fitzhugh Carroll. And he's a lovely person. It's fun to get to know him, but also to have his language here for a little while. And some things fit in well, and then some things I have to do really fast. Yeah, but so yeah, the material thing, I don't know. That's an interesting. I think that's my best answer.
Yeah. So here's another that someone said about your work, which I thought, and it speaks to what you were talking about, I think, and it says, it talks about although stagnant, they, the sculptures, remain imbued with the sense that the forms and surfaces will continue to undulate and recalibrate as time passes. And so I guess I'm going back to the first quote that I asked you about too. And I guess I'm just really, really intrigued by the idea that again, an object that can hold its imprint, like you said, until you're ready to touch it again, also is something that contains a sense of movement in it, both on the surface and sort of internally. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that thought.
I was thinking about that the other day because I was looking at these stone carvings that Noguchi made that are they're so still. Like he made them at the later part of his career, and they're very still and simple. Like they're just these incredibly quiet objects. And I was thinking, as a younger person, like the impetus, because sculpture is an odd thing, like to make this thing that's not useful directly for any other reason, to be kind of animated and have an ability to move someone or to get them to think about something. So I think there's like an impulse I think it's very hard to do it the other way, where you get it to be, so still and quiet that it provokes this, So in a sense, like, how do you take this object on the floor and separate it from all the chairs in here so that when I come in to look at it, I don't just ignore it. It becomes like animated in my mind's eye as having this sort of other possibility to it. Maybe not so much with like the physical object itself, but getting me to start thinking about something else. And like really good music, does that, and it's got maybe the advantage of not being, tangibly present like a chair, but it also has to separate from all the other sounds that aren't so wonderful. So I think the quote, I remember I wrote something about this like 6 or 7 years ago, but I had a sculpture that was installed in Union Square Park in New York City, and it was very like sort of animated, and it almost looked like it was ready to move, sort of on the turn. And like ever since then, I keep trying to like make things not move as much, but it's like there's this impulse. It's like a way to get the material to separate from the other stuff, as if it feels like it's on its way somewhere, like it's a sort of transition or something.
And so when you work on material like this and you're welding versus casting, I imagine that treating material in those two ways changes very much how that works for you. Can you talk about the difference between those two processes?
So the making something that's constructed out of, so like as an example, this sort of carpet-like sculpture that's on the floor, this sort of like landscape thing, it starts out, I take these like long bars of metal and cut them into buckets, like maybe 5 or 6 buckets of different length, just randomized sort of lengths. And I try and do as much of the kind of laborious upfront work ahead of time, so that way you can be a little more spontaneous and pay attention to what's going on. It's almost like a painter having their paints mixed ahead of going to work with them. So it's sort of one step after the next, connecting things and then cutting them off. I guess, so it builds sort of cumulatively, and casting as like a process is about replication, so it's like having a model and then replicating the model. So I always like suffer with how to deal with casting, because I don't want to necessarily have everything figured out, because then it's like to spend all that time making the casting feels like, it feels like I just signed up to work for someone else. So, but I don't want that, so I have to design in some flaw. So like actually all the way in the back corner, you can see there's like a window. Underneath that, there's like these two molds that are molds of a welded object that I'll pour wax into. A lot of the castings are made using the lost wax process, so in a nutshell, it's a process of making an object or a model in wax, then making a kind of fire mold around it, and then melting it away. So for a brief moment, it's like a footprint in the snow. There's nothing existing in that space. And then you replace that space by pouring metal into the mold. So what I found that I really like to do is make waxes in molds that are replicas of things, or like sections of forms that I make this way, and then sort of adjust them or do things to them. It gets very cold in here in the winter, and the wax gets very brittle. So, like, I lifted one up and it just shattered, and it was great, because when I cast all the pieces, they looked like ice stacked on top of each other. And then the next winter I tried the same thing, thinking I was really clever. I forgot I put burlap in the wax, so when I dropped it, nothing happened. It just like went, and they're on the table back. It looked like nothing because they're flat, but they're back there. I can show you later, but they look like these crushed fabric pieces that sort of have the reference of this sort of tessellated form I was making before. And one thing that I really enjoy in terms of like reference is sculpture's ability to like latch on to things, and you can borrow other people's ideas. And there was a German painter named Konrad Wilz, who was like a 15th century painter, and he was making like mostly like religious iconography, like images that feel very restrictive, but the gowns and things are really wild in his images. They're like, they do things that no fabric should ever do. And so they kind of, when the thing broke, it looked like some of the silhouettes of the dresses from the paintings. So, that's kind of what's, I think, interesting about sculpture if you were to think about it as like one thing to the next, it gives an opportunity to like all of a sudden learn about something new, and to think about someone like Konrad Wilz and his paintings. Did I go off?
No, that was
great. So, but the difference between casts, it's sort of all the same, because essentially, like all sculpture, it has to do with organizing material, but in the end, it's almost like the effect of the sculpture it's not the thing anymore. It's like this experience of making something as a way to learn about other things in the world, and then hopefully it's not like totally useless paperweight after that, and somebody else maybe learns about Konrad Wilz's paintings and thinks it's fabulous because they see this, and I think there are other great things that can happen too, in terms of like the role that these kind of objects have. But for me, in terms of like material and the differences, it's pretty similar.
Yeah.
But it's like, how do you get something that's made one way to bend into the same kind of thinking if it has a totally different... It's like if you wanted to build a house out of wood and then you decided, I'm going to build a house out of like river stone. I'm sure like there'd be it would take a while to like figure out how you could think of the windows the same way or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It sounds, and then I'm going to open this up for questions, so if you have anything brewing in there, get it ready. So it sounds to me, and then tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like that there's an impulse to work with materials, and the materials teach you, And if they don't perform the way you wanted, like the plastic mold that shattered into a million pieces, that there's something about that sudden transformation, the unexpected, right, which inspires or feeds you and takes your imagination on another ride. So it isn't about just working something to make it into something. There's a conversation almost, or dialogue.
Oh yeah, it's almost feeling like you're waiting around for something to happen. It's like in the morning, I usually walk on this little beach out there. I walk over like almost every time. There's nothing spectacular. It's like the same stuff. And then like once in a while, there's like this thing that never existed before. So, it's like this sort of chance encounter. And so like it doesn't really make a lot of sense to like make bronze cast, to do, I think if it was just about like the product, like I often work for a lot of other people that maybe wouldn't want to have the space to make a casting, which doesn't necessarily make sense. One of the advantages to having the furnace and the things to do it is just the material language of that process, and it almost like if someone's cooking at home, like you can smell what it is, and you can be entranced by that. So like making castings here compared to like sending them to an art foundry somewhere else, which is a typical. Often casting is used as a way to for a sculptor to support themselves by being able to make editions of the same object, so copies, but also freeing their time. So instead of making 12 of these things, they send it to a foundry and then they send back 12 and they have a way to make an income. That's like traditional sort of view of editioning, and casting's like embedded in that because it's about reproduction of a model accurately, like in the most basic way. But I sort of stumbled into, I had a teacher in art school who taught about metal casting in a kind of 19th century, really poetic way, and he would say like, when you pull these two bowl or like plant looking, what do you call it?
Urns?
Urn looking things, or crucibles. So they get filled with metal and then it's melted in that furnace. When you lift it out, he would say, oh, it's like the birth of a planet. And it feels that way. It's like this birth process. It's something new, and it's really beautiful. But I think, I'm really attracted to sort of seeing what goes wrong, what's happenstance, and then trying to bend that into the language that I'm interested in, which I think is one of the, like these objects on the floor are these, like, my son Leland, who's in the other room, he's 3 and he spills a lot of things, and it's a hassle, but it's really beautiful sometimes. So he gave me the idea to pay attention to things that spill, and a few months ago I was pouring aluminum into a mold for someone, and some spilt out the side, and it went in the floor, and there was a crack, and it like went in and it wouldn't come out for months. And eventually it flipped over, and the surface was beautiful, and as metal cools, it's cooling, it's cooling very quickly as it spreads as a liquid, and so the edges that are exposed to air tend to be really round and smooth and beautiful. And so I've been doing some experiments of pouring aluminum on the floor because of that, to make some, I don't know if it'll find its way into sculpture, but I was interested in making some kind of coffee, some sort of tables this way, which is, I remember being in art school thinking furniture, like anything that has a function, it's no way. It's like, that's like, you gotta stay away from all that. It's a slippery slope. And then so the back half here, there's like a railing, and then there's some radiator covers from New York Public Library. I do a lot of these like very like dictated things that are material-wise, they're nice. But some of the projects that I was working on, like all of them were like, there were so many that were furniture. And I said, oh, maybe I should make some, try the other. It's like, you could think of maybe furniture and sculpture as being like similar, but having like two trees with overlapping branches or something. So, So we needed a coffee table, so I said, oh, the spill. So that's, I don't know where that will exactly go. But so there's one on the floor and then two that are kind of upright.
Yeah, I love that idea of the intermingling branches. I think that there's something really beautiful about, instead of saying that they're completely different or there's no way that one can impact the other, and that's sort of a really beautiful image.
I mean, there's a furniture maker named Wendell Castle who makes these really kind of playful and delightful twists on furniture, and he's kind of incredible because he makes these things that they carry the weight of furniture, like you recognize what it is, but at the same time it's a separate thing. In terms of like almost being more like sculpture.
Do I have questions from the audience? Is there anything, Bruce? Please do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the table, Jacques Mini's younger brother made furniture.
Oh yeah, Diago?
Very similar to what Jacques Mini was doing. But the whole idea, in art school, there is that whole kind of, what's commercial art and what's fine art.
Yeah.
And you're sort of, as a student, and then you don't want to cross that path because you don't want to get tainted. But at the same time, a lot of collaborative things and take you there just out of the necessity of the request. But the other thing is to back up further, and really the history of art, art is a utilitarian thing. It's never in a sense not been a utilitarian thing, even from the first cave paintings or the cave sculpture. Or in churches, especially churches, they're utilitarian for the church, they're utilitarian for the state. So art is not this sort of, for me, I'm just speaking for myself, but it's not this thing that's so isolated that it becomes a foreign thing and has its own sphere of usage. It is like the roots. It is all constantly, he was Morris, English designer, who said, have nothing around you that's not beautiful and useful. And to me, that's really the purpose of art, is to allow us to have these beautiful things around us that allow our lives to be enriched, whether that's just on a visual level or it's just on a sensory level or whatever. But I'd be hesitant to discount anything as not art.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with you about it. I meant it more in like with an object that, for instance, if it's a cabinet, it's very difficult, to make that beautiful cabinet sort of divorce itself from the actual use. For me, I really like the kind of objects that are hard, that almost feel like a foggy day, like you can't exactly tell what it is, but it's almost that, And so that on a personal level, it's like to make something that has this sort of direct function. I completely agree with you, but as my own hurdle, to think of those things, I think it becomes a nice tightrope to find the edge.
It just depends on which aspect you make the lead horse.
Yeah.
You need both horses to get there, kind of. But one you recognize before you recognize the other. You recognize it as something that is artwork before you realize it's also can be a utilitarian.
Yeah, that's a nice way to look at it.
That's what they were.
I love the idea of the two horses. That's really compelling because there's always movement. Because they're always in motion, those horses. Stephen.
Do you listen to
A little
music
louder.
while you're working? And if so, what is your favorite music to listen to?
Oh, that's a good question.
Let me just, he just asked if Malcolm listens to music while he's working, and if so, what kind of music?
When I'm here by myself, I like having WQXR on. It's not. I usually if I'm not here, I sometimes leave it on so I can come back in the morning and it greets me or something. But not it's a lot of these things are kind of noisy too, so it kind of it's hard to work exactly with. I don't know. I was never into wearing headphones and listening to stuff, so not so much. But I like having WQXR on the background. One day we had a group of students here from Queens College. I would work there once a week teaching a bronze casting class, and one year the building's gas line was leaking, so they like canceled everything, and the students, everything was a mess, and we figured out they could come here. So I brought them here, and we decided to do opera while we did the casting, which was nice.
It's wonderful.
I'm just curious about the pieces outside. Are they on their way somewhere? Are they there permanently?
No, so I made, there's a group of sculptures outside that look like a landscape, and they're a bit pushed together to make getting in and out of the building with stuff possible, but they get set up in a way that they look like kind of one sort of stainless steel facade or like hill, and then as you get closer, they break up. This is like my idea about how to set them up. They were going to go like several years ago to Prospect Park, and then the park was very nervous that kids, because it's like such a public place, that kids would trip or like get hurt on them because they're so low. So I don't know where they'll end up going, but probably somewhere that's not as, it was something I never thought about, because like to me when you look at sculpture, it's almost like it's a playground for your mind, but it's also a playground for some, and I think like I'm glad it didn't go there in a way, because it probably would have came back with like, it's this skateboard marks up and down the whole thing, but I'm not sure where they're going to end up. But for now, I've liked having them here, because like in the winter they all get covered with snow, and so does everything else, and it just looks like it's part of the place, and it keeps the neighbors' trucks from coming too close. So, yeah. Yeah.
You spoke a lot about being inspired by nature, like the ice forms on the river. Do you get inspiration from industrial sources? Like, are you inspired by Metro North going by?
Yeah. That's funny. So like, I learned about like metalworking in art school in a really informal way. So like, the way that works is they show you how not to get hurt, and then they like show you how to turn the welding machine on, and you can try things, but there's no real, there's another side of that stuff that's like machining and like precision tools and all this stuff. And through my sort of, what do you call it, like day job projects, I like ended up having to do more machining and stuff, and I started to like, there's an aesthetic to like the heavy vices and the handles and the knobs, and like there's a table on the left it's called a platen table, and it's a cast iron table that's like this thick, and it has square holes for attaching things. And that was like, I think up until like the 1940s, that was like what you would have if you had a metalworking workshop as like for fixturing. The one on the right is like a modern version that's easier to work with, but the old one's so beautiful. It's like, it's like you can feel the weight of it when you walk up to it. It's like, it's like a magnet. It like pulls you over to it. So I think, there's like definitely, I think just through dealing with the materials, there's like an appreciation of like the types of clamps, and a lot of this stuff is beautiful. Mm-hmm. So,
Good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Sorry, we both called.
Rick.
I'll let you go.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, you might have a train.
Metro North.
Oh, next person.
Right, oops. What?
Question.
Yeah, I will.
Oh,
Yeah.
So the first question is, do you know what the original purpose of this building was? And the second question is, at what point do you make the decision about the finish of the works? And,
Yeah.
when do you know that you're done?
Oh, okay.
All right, so I'm going to repeat the question, and thank you. So the first question is, does Malcolm know what the original purpose of the building was? And the second question is, when do you know your piece is finished? Did I get that right?
Yeah, well,
Yeah. Or the finished surface.
Yeah. Or when do you decide?
Yeah.
I guess that's, yeah.
So, I'll start with the building. That's maybe the easiest one. This building, I believe, what I found out from, there was a gentleman who's since passed away, but he came down here like every day. His name was Dickie, I'm forgetting his last name. Dick, does anyone know his last name? Okay. Anyway, he came and a few other people from the Historical Society told me that this was brought here in the 50s by the Navy. So the Navy and Columbia Labs, I believe, used this property in the 1950s for doing research on hydrophones. And they were responsible for the hydrophonic cable that was laid across the Atlantic for like monitoring submarines. And I think within this building, the doors back here are new, but when I first came here, there were doors that were bolted shut that had been maybe hit with a truck or something. They were mangled, but there's a ramp that goes to the train tracks. And I found out they would take the copper cable from Hastings, from Anaconda, and bring it here. And then they would attach, at the time, were like top secret hydrophones to them here. And then there was a dock, and the Navy ships would come, and they'd take these, hundreds of miles of copper cable with hydrophones that were assembled in the building next door, and they laid them across the Atlantic. And I think within like 20 years that became like kind of obsolete thing, but it's still used for whale research, for like listening to migration patterns and stuff. So I think it was basically like storage and maybe a little bit of assembly was the original purpose. And then I think in the 60s or late 70s, a trucking company that was out of Dobbs Ferry, I think a freight shipping company, had this building, and they stored their trucks in here. And then I think I've been here for about 11 years. Before that, there's this bridge that you all came over. That bridge was like condemned, I think. It's now it's okay to go over.
It was safe.
So actually, none of you are leaving. No, but so this bridge was out of commission, and then they could no longer bring trucks here, and then it was used for I think the stuff that didn't have a home for this complex of buildings. So when I first moved here, there was 2 boats, a van, a number of lawnmowers, and I think there must have been 6 inches of dirt in the ground, and all the wind. It didn't look quite like this, but it was kind of the same. It had nice. It's a very nice structure to work in, and when the back door is open, the air just comes right through. So for anything that's to do with sanding or material, the dust just goes out, which is kind of nice. There's all sorts of things that I use to capture dust and especially welding fumes. You're supposed to capture those as you're making them. But hopefully they'll start to do this, but a lot of art schools don't teach you that much about the safety of dealing with these types of processes. Oh, I got to answer the second part, and then I'll go to you. But the other part, the finishes of the sculptures, some of them, with the pieces that are made of stainless steel, there are a lot of different finishes that you can create. So I think the one all the way in the corner has this kind of burnished finish, and these 3, I kind of knew that would be what I would like to have them look like eventually, because it makes everything kind of be at the same level. Whereas sometimes with metals, if you leave a surface that's got
They slowed
That's a
down
quiet
just for
one.
you. I was just
Yeah.
thinking.
Sometimes it's difficult if you end up with a surface that has got a lot of sanding marks, or this object behind us, the frame. It takes 6 or 7 steps to get these stainless steel bars to lose that sheen that you see at the corners. That's from the welding process, but eventually the goal is to make those corners look like the one that's over there, so it just reads as an image rather than all these different moments. And then, but then on some of the other sculptures, it kind of it sort of figures itself out. Or for me, that way, because sometimes I don't really have a great idea of exactly what's gonna work. And then in terms of knowing when I'm finished, I try to exhaust the thing and get as much mileage as I can. So I like this object, this panel that is all filled in, and that one, when lying on the ground, they kind of work quite nicely together, and they look like these sort of almost like these Conrad Woltz paintings that I was talking about. So I'm hoping to make a mold of them and cast two like fragments or almost the whole thing of both, so they could be like a floor object. And then the bigger one, like I think this one is going to stay with these sort of like open and closed, and then the bigger one I want to lift up and make like a grid that's similar to this underneath it, so it's like kind of like a boulder, but just the top, like a snow cap or something. But originally it was all one thing, so, and then hopefully if it all works out well, but like the next time we do this, that thing will be like two other objects. So there's a couple sculptures on the front as you walk in that are all castings, and they're all from the same form, just reused a few times. So, and then if the thing ends up leaving here, then it's, I guess, really finished. But while it's in here, it's like fair game. It's like, it's like, oh, that'll be great. Like, I don't know, this object I made as a college student, these sort of two parallel forms, and I always loved the bottom of it a lot, and at the time even debated whether I should connect them, because just the bottom was simple and kind of beautiful and reminded me of like hay fields where they groom them in one direction. So on top of that wooden box is like a wax version from a mold of that thing. So I'm hoping to cast it into something, and then while doing that, one of them broke, and so I have a couple other ideas. So as long as it's here, it's on an evolving thing.
Great.
Oh yeah, so I went to SUNY Purchase, and for undergraduate degree in sculpture, and then I went to a program at Lesley University for a master's degree. I was teaching at a community college and wanted to keep doing that, and so I said, you got to get a degree, and then I met my wife there, so that was well worth it. So Purchase and Lesley.
Oh, that's
University.
great.
Yeah. I know you were.
What is the life of a sculptor like during the week? I mean, you have a day job. Is this just a creative process here? Or does somebody call you up on the phone, listen, I need something 50 feet high, 25 feet wide to put in front of them?
I don't know. Sometimes they're pulling your leg, they call you and tell you that. No, there aren't that many phone calls. No, but I don't know. So I rented this space right out of art school because it was broken. So the owner was, I think, in his late 90s and lived in California. It was like a perfect storm, and so then I was trying to figure out, what can I do to make a living? And I was teaching at a community college in Queens, and then I started doing projects for other people, like making for some sculptors, but then also some architects, like making things for buildings. And then that ended up being like a great way to create a buffer for to not have to, to basically to allow the sculptures to like unravel over time. And it's for instance, like the two projects that are in the back, these radiator covers and then a railing, like the goal is to like look at the watch and get it done as quickly as possible, and then that's great. And then with these, it's like if it takes as long as possible, it ends up being better. Otherwise, you shortchange yourself. And so, it doesn't, the economics of that is, unless you can demand enough money to take as long as you possibly can, it's kind of tricky. So I kind of try and balance the two by being able to work on sculpture, and then sometimes that takes care of itself. But most of the sort of buffer to have the studio and stuff comes out of doing these projects for other people. And the best ones there are a couple architects I work with that allow me to take their idea and then sort of maneuver it into something that I think is better for what they're doing, and the aesthetics have to be kind of aligned, otherwise it's a problem. 90% are like, here's what we want you to make, and make it. But I made a bronze screen out of bamboo that was formed, and there's some of it laying by a sculpture in the front. There are these like brass rods that are formed to look like bamboo, and it made like a 12 or 13-foot screen. So those type of projects they call and they say, can you make this thing for this space? Or that's been my experience. I think it's different for everyone, and I work for a few other sculptors too, maintain their stuff.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing as a kid you did a lot of drawing and so on, and then maybe you evolved into doing some clay sculpting. But how did you evolve into metal? Do you remember your first metal sculpture? And then, when did you decide you wanted to make it the focus of your life?
That's a good question. So I remember as a high school student, I was dyslexic and had it wasn't the format for me to learn about the world. So in trying to find something, I think my dad and I'm like, and I was interested in construction. I worked for a carpenter, making things when I was 13 or 14. I think at 15 there was a program in Northern Westchester where they taught people how to weld, and it was mostly people who wanted to build motorcycles. And I remember going, and there was a guy named Sam who was a ship welder for the Brooklyn Navy Yard. That was his profession, and he taught a welding course. And I was pretty hooked from doing that, because the process of welding, although from probably everyone has if someone's never done any welding, from the outside it looks like a very kind of machismo, really tough thing. But while you're doing it, it's sort of like sewing or stitching. It's really soothing and it's rhythmic and almost meditative. So I think purposely I sort of made sculptures that just involve days of welding. So I would get really excited about that, because the ones outside, they were all put together. I usually just sort of attach them at little points first, and then go back and do all the welding at once, save it for the end, dessert or something. And and it'd be it was 3 months of just stitching them together, and it was really relaxing. So I think that kind of by chance was my introduction to the material, and then it sort of started to become what was around. In art school, the metal workshop was not popular, the printmaking. I always wanted to do that, but it was you had to wait for hours to go use the printing press. So I said, I can't, have to do something else. I guess I have to pick my mom.
Share a Malcolm story. I'm her mom, and I have many great Malcolm stories, but when you said just a minute ago that your sculptures sometimes unravel, I was okay, that's a sign. I'm telling the story. So the story kind of popped into my head earlier in the talk when you were talking about forms and the ice and seeing things. And I just had this image of you and your younger brother, who's about 2 years younger, Jim, in the basement of our house in Ardsley. And the basement was about the size of that wall square. So it was a nice big space, a nice big basement where I had, young mother, Malcolm was probably 3 or 4, a lot of paper towels. I'd gone to the big box store and was hoarding paper towels for some reason. So Malcolm was often the instigator, and he would get Jim to, do his dirty work with him. And they unraveled. I just want to, embellish just pallets of paper towels. And I could see Malcolm enjoying the rhythm and the form and just and he could stick to things like nobody else. He could work at whatever he was doing for a long time. So I came down the stairs. Oh, it's awfully quiet. And I go down the stairs, and 2 little boys are in literally a sea about 3 feet of paper towels. And it was beautiful. It was an ocean with So I think that's the beginnings.
I guess
you so much for sharing that. That's
That reminds me, my son is 3 now, and seeing like the things that he's interested in is like, he's got much better ideas already than me, which is a good sign. But like, it's just the way kids deal with material and stuff and question it is kind of.
Yeah, when I was there saying, I would think I was pretty exasperated.
That makes sense.
okay. I just checked my watch. We do have time for one last question if somebody else wanted to ask a question. I just saw a bunch of hands over here and I feel bad that I cut you all off. So, all right, here we go.
I'll take the last one, thank you. My husband enjoys welders.
A little louder.
My husband enjoys welders. And I asked him, he made a comment about the welding. And I said, well, Frank had into, he says, oh no, I just watch and I block.
Yeah.
But he's pretty good. He said, "You tell him I said he's pretty good."
Oh, that's the nicest thing. That's the nicest thing I've ever heard from someone who is involved with welding. Because the last person who saw my welding said, like, you're lucky you don't do bridges because they fall over. There's a.
That's what. Okay, so on that note, no bridges.
No bridges. I'm not allowed.
Thank you all for coming today, Malcolm.
Thank you guys for coming.